I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing the Middle East and Europe in the wake of US withdrawal from its deep involvement in Middle East affairs over these last decades. The much heralded pivot to Asia seems dramatically to be underway. The United States gunboats are practically sailing up the Yangtze. Well, not quite, they'd be sunk if they did. But they're certainly sailing up the South China Sea. They have dragooned a couple of pedalos alongside them. Britain and Australia have hooked up in a new alliance with the United States in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific region. The whole picture of international affairs may be about to change. The Iraqi parliament has dismissed the American occupation of the country, and it seems only a matter of time before the last American forces leave the country. The government in Damascus has prevailed, together with its allies, and the still trundling along low-level insurgency in the still occupied parts of Syria appear to be doomed, not least because for President Erdogan in Turkey, it's unlikely ever to be glad, confident morning again in Turkey's relations with the United States. And of course, the United States has suffered a humiliating reversal in Afghanistan, scuttling, escaping from the country, much as they did from Vietnam many decades ago. So if the United States is pulling out of the broadly defined Middle East and North African area, if it is pivoting to Asia, will everybody else leave those areas alone? Will the people of the Muslim world be allowed freely to choose their own future, or will somebody try to fill that vacuum? Will that somebody be Europe? Will Europe be united in its policies towards the broadly defined Middle East? Will France, now smarting from the stab in the back, as their foreign minister called it, from the United States, Britain, and Australia, seek to strike out on a different, maybe quite different course in the region and in the world? These are all topics which are of interest to me as an enthusiastic amateur, but my audience, as always, are distinguished experts. But the first of those, preeminent, is the Reverend Frank Galloway. Father, thank you very much for joining us, looking like you've just come from the cricket grounds of England. Christians have had a, how shall I put it, checkered history, European Christians, a checkered history in the Middle East, from the Crusades to the invasion and occupation of Iraq, Afghanistan, the war in Syria, and so on. Will the Europeans have the stomach for trying to fill America's shoes in the Middle East, and will they be welcomed if they do?
Well, first of all, you mentioned France, and France quite interests me, and I have some respect for the foreign policy of France. Because if we go back to General de Gaulle, not only did he put forward the idea of l'Europe des patries, the Europe of nations, as opposed to some sort of federal state, as we seem to be having now, but also pulled out of NATO. And he wanted to have France to have its own force de frappe, military force, independent, and nuclear weapons to suit. Now, that was reversed later on. But France has this idea of being different because it isn't Anglo-Saxon. After World War II, the world hegemony has been Anglo-Saxon. Although nobody uses that word anymore. In France, we do use it as Anglo-Saxon. So it has its own sense of genuine identity. And I think coming back to Iraq, Macron can offer, because Iraq right now, the situation is terrible, especially with summer scorching heat, electricity and water shortage is terrible. France can, when Macron went over recently, he offered to put forward a deal for energy supplies and so on. So in this sense, I think France is not too ready. Also, Macron stressed the sovereignty of Iraq, which is very important, especially vis-à-vis Turkey. You mentioned Erdogan. Because Turkey, under the pretext of pursuing the Kurdish separatists as trespassing into Iraqi territories, has got forces in Iraqi territories, which it shouldn't have. It's got a military presence. Turkey is violating the sovereignty of Iraq. So in that sense, Macron was making signals, say, Turkey, don't go too far. Erdogan, of course.
Well, France is relatively unblemished in Iraq. President Chirac stayed out of the Iraq War, opposed the Iraq War. But in the Levant, of course, France's face is rather more dirty in Syria and in Lebanon.
Yes, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which goes back to that again during the First World War, to partition the Middle East, and France wanted its share. I'm not saying that France is innocent like a little child, but in terms of power politics and the consequences of power politics, it seems to me that France is a counterbalance to this hegemonic presence in the United States. And I have to say, I'm sorry, Britain has been a kind of poodle since the days of Tony Blair of the United States. It hasn't really put forward a genuine, separate, distinct, independent policy towards the Middle East. Britain's involvement towards the Middle East has been a catalogue of disasters. So in that sense, France, although, I mean, you went back to the Crusades, I have to say, for me, the Crusades were wars of defense. Not wars, let's see, but that's controversial.
There's not many takers for that thesis in the audience that's watching this show. Joseph Robertson, you're the strategic director of Orthodox Conservatives group in the United Kingdom. I presume you don't mean in a religious sense.
Not at all, no.
Orthodox, just to be clear, because there's a lot of Orthodox people watching this program. Political orthodoxy. I sensed a difference of opinion between you and Father Frank on the British role in the region. Have your say.
Sure. Well, I think at the moment, going back to what you asked there, is there an appetite in Europe for it? Is there an appetite for more military intervention? I think the simple answer is no. And I think the British people have been against military intervention since it was started. They didn't really have a say in it. We were dragged into that conflict. I think what we have to consider as well in the situation with France is, yes, France could be a deal breaker, especially with Iran. I think that's something everybody probably agrees on, but there doesn't seem to be much appetite for them to do so.
Well, not until when they were ritually humiliated by the US, UK, Australia deal. I'm intrigued by the possibility that, and Father Frank mentioned the era was an important era for me when France was outside of NATO's political structures and took a relatively independent line on foreign policy. I wonder if Macron's response to AUKUS will be to try to stride towards a kind of Gaullist independence.
Well, what we've seen, I mean, recently with the Baghdad conference, I mean, being the first push, I think, to try and establish France as the leading light to kind of become the deal breaker in the region, is that they don't really have the necessary relationship with Turkey to kind of affect that. I think there's some tension there, which isn't surface level, but they don't have the support. It's almost like they're being sneered at in some locations. But what I think we've seen now is that France themselves will not take a step back because of what's happened, like you said. So they have to be very careful with how they tread. Are they going to tread on toes? The other thing as well, the US are withdrawing militarily, but they're not withdrawing fiscally. Since 2004, they've been hoarding Iraqi wealth. If there was any power breakdown in the region, for instance, like Iran was claiming there would be, the US could shut down their funding quite quickly, and then we would see a complete freeze in the area. So yes, France could escalate their military intervention if they wanted to, but would they be able to achieve the same power hold that the US has been building since 2003? I don't think so.
Jerry Dowling, you're the polar opposite of Joseph. I suppose you're an orthodox revolutionary socialist. So let me pitch my thesis to you, that the United States pivot to Asia is real and a commensurate drawdown in the Middle East is a necessary consequence, and that some will try and fill a vacuum. And France looks the most likely candidate right now.
Well, in my view, France won't be able to do it on its own, and it will not seek to do it on its own. There's all sorts of problems and difficulties between Europe and the United States. For instance, Germany has now completed the Nord 2 pipeline, and that will begin to work quite shortly against very strong opposition from the United States. They said, look, this is what we need from Russia, and we're going to have it, whatever the United States says. And of course, there was all that massive insults over the Ukraine when it turned out that Merkel's phone had been tapped by the CIA and etc. And Victoria Nuland's contemptuous dismissal of the EU over the Ukraine. Well, we're going to
don't use her swear word.
Yeah, we're going to put our own man in there. And as she boasted afterwards, they had to spend $5 billion overturning in regime change, and they were taking the control in there. But so Europe is divided, and of course the AUKUS agreement, as you have pointed out, has left France absolutely hopping mad. That's what he said. He said we have been stabbed in the back by this agreement. France has some 1.5 million citizens living in the Indo-Asian region, and it's got 8,000 troops. So it's very much concerned with its relationship there, and they haven't just lost $900 million contract to supply submarines, but they're totally ignored. So I think France are hopping mad, but hopping mad as they are, I don't think they will be able to replace the United States in any serious way in the region. My pitch on the thing is to see, well, how is this going to influence class struggle? What is the situation going to develop as regards that in Afghanistan, in Iran, and in Syria? We've just had a new president elected in France.
In Iran.
In Iran, sorry, I mean. In Iran. And
maybe next year in France.
Maybe next year in France. But in Iran,
Well, those are the questions I have been debating with Iranian comrades recently, and I think they're very pertinent issues to debate now.
Well, let's hear from France first. From Hamid Shriet in Paris, is a political commentator and columnist. Welcome, Hamid.
You're welcome.
Hamid, can you tell us, what is France looking for in Iraq?
Yeah, well, the French president, his visit, Macron held the Baghdad conferences as a major boost for the Iraq and his leadership. Macron vowed to maintain troops in Iraq regardless of the American choices. I think it's very important for France because France now is coming back to Iraq and to the Arab world. The policies of Macron is first of all to help and to develop the Iraq, to protect as well the sovereignty of Iraq. And this is very important. We've seen that the American policies in Afghanistan or in Iraq has failed. So I think the policies of Macron is good. He's doing a very good job to maintain and to stabilize the region. We know that there are many tensions with Iran and Iraq, between Sunni and Shia. We've seen as well Saudi Arabia with the conflict in Yemen. So I think if France can take the leadership with the European Union to stabilize and to give more peaceful and to protect the many sovereignty in the region, not only in Iraq, but also in Yemen, will be a very good point. The second thing that France would like to stabilize Iraq is to rebuild the country.
But the question is, why is France seeking to help develop Iraq at this point in time? And what benefit would France get from that?
Since the General de Gaulle, since 1965-68, France has always a good relationship with the Arab world. Remember that General de Gaulle have been visiting many countries such as China, such as Iraq, such as Morocco, Algeria, even Iran, India. So I think France has a very powerful message to deliver to the international community. We've seen the failure of America and Afghanistan. And I think the European Union can stabilize and develop other countries to fight the terrorism with, of course, a bilateral relationship with Iran. So I'm part, and I do agree, and it's very important to have also a relationship to fight the terrorism with Iran, with Pakistan. I think this is important. This visit in Mosul, with Macron has visited the church and the mosque, is very symbolic to show that terrorism is not about a question, is not about religion, but terrorism attacked any religion.
Some analysts think that France's move is motivated by fear and suspicion of Iran, and that any French moves in Iraq would be designed to reduce Iranian influence in Iraq and in the region.
I think this is it's a mistake. It's wrong. I will say that France has always supported the Iranian government. We've seen the last negotiation with the nuclear negotiation. France shown the opportunity of the Iranian government that it's important to have a dialogue with the international community and the European community. We've seen Macron. He would like to visit maybe Iran before the French election. So we've seen the opening of the French opening policies in Iran. And I think now it's a time to build a relationship with the whole region to stabilize this region. And it is important. We have to act. And this is important from the Emmanuel Macron. France is a powerful country today, but Macron has to also concert with other countries such as Iran, which has very regional powerful in the region. And I think it is important. The Macron policies today, it's a pragmatic policies which will, of course, open more opportunity economically to France, but also to build and stabilize the region for the interest of people. The major interest is for people. People are suffering in the region. We've seen the Yemen, the conflict, and we've seen many humanitarian crises. And I think Iran can play a major role. It's a powerful country in the region. And this is its time to build relationship with all countries in the region.
Wouldn't the French public ask why their country was sending their armed forces to yet another country? I mean, again, what is the benefit of all this for France?
Well, any country has an interest, of course, outside and abroad. France has its own interest and his own agenda, of course, to defend the human right and to build a dialogue of civilization. That is why Macron, when he had delivered his speech, he said that it's important to fight terrorism, but also to develop the country. But I believe that the European interests with France, which Macron, don't forget, he has taken the leadership as the president of the European Union, because there is a turning presidency in the European Union, and it is the turn of the French presidency now in the European Union. And I believe that France can play a major role in the region, despite of other countries who has more an appetite in the region, such as America or UK. I believe today, and we've seen the stand recently about the armament contract with Australia in France. We've seen that the new reconfiguration, there is an axis of geopolitical reconfiguration in the region against China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran, which with Australia, America, and UK, France has been, got out of this alliance, and we've seen that France can play a major role and other roles and can give an other vision to stabilize the region.
Father, rather a similar take to your own there, coming from our correspondent in Paris, but of course it may not, or it may have been a Freudian slip by Jerry. There may be a new president of France next year. Has the AUKUS ruckus damaged, or might it help Macron secure re-election?
God knows, but as you know, Macron was only elected because people wanted to keep out Marine Le Pen way back. His qualifications to be president were minimal. He had very little experience.
It was the Tony Blair of French politics.
Well, I hate Tony Blair, his ideas, but as a politician, he's very able, very clever. I don't think Macron compares to Tony Blair, but that's, if you like, a sideline. But I also wanted to mention, for example, it's relevant, but it's significant to me as a man of faith, that when the Pope Francis, went to Iraq only back in early March, he met with Grand Ayatollah Sistani, a leading figure of Shia Islam, and of course the majority of people in Iraq are Shia. And they had a wonderful meeting. And actually Francis was so impressed by the Grand Ayatollah, said, this is a man who has affected me deeply. It's just a meeting a light, it's changing my life. And I told myself, well, this is kind of tricky, isn't it? Is he going to convert to Islam now?
Perhaps he did in private. Perhaps we'll find out in his memoirs.
No.
More of this after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London, but discussing Europe, France, and the Middle East. It is, I think, being underestimated so far the extent to which France has suffered a terrible national humiliation. It may give rise to a new Gaullist atmosphere in France. It may be that generating such an atmosphere is the only way that President Macron can survive the presidential election next year. That could mean that France will have to begin to take a rather different and perhaps more strident approach to foreign policy in the Middle East. It may be that he'll cozy up to the Iranians, cozy up maybe to the Chinese, maybe to the Russians. That would teach them, wouldn't it? Let's hear from an American, Professor David Cartwright from Northern Indiana in the US. He's the director of the Global Policy Institute at, appropriately, the Notre Dame University's Kroc Institute. Professor.
Thank you.
Professor, now that the US is withdrawing from Iraq, or to put it another way, retreating from Iraq and the wider region, what's your take on that?
Well, the US has said it will reduce its combat role and will no longer have combat forces in Iraq. But if you'd read carefully, nowhere do they say that they're going to remove all US troops from Iraq. Although, of course, this is a political demand among many people in Iraq, but the US has been ambiguous about this question. And now when you see that there are also French troops involved, the way I read it is that the United States is diminishing its active combat role, but it will remain in Iraq, and it has a continuing interest in trying to exert its military political influence in Iraq and in the region. And it's doing this now, it seems, in at least in parallel with, and perhaps even in direct partnership with, France in terms of its role now.
It's quite clear that the US has severely reduced its troop levels in Iraq and is planning to reduce it further. Indeed, Iraq has told them all to leave. Why is the US doing this now?
Well, I think the United States has gone through this very painful realization that the policies that we've employed to fight terrorism have not worked. The whole mission in Afghanistan has ended in an embarrassing, humiliating failure for the United States. And this is part of the reevaluation that the Biden administration is making, that the United States can't pursue a war policy against terrorism. At least that's what they say publicly. And certainly the United States is no longer going to be sending large numbers of troops or engaging in any kind of combat operations against terrorist groups. Again, this is what they claim. But my view is that the overall strategy of US military engagement and involvement in Iraq and other countries continues. And the belief remains that it's possible to counter groups like Daesh, like ISIS and others through military means. And I'm convinced that this is a completely wrong strategy. The terrorism is a serious problem. It is a grave threat to human rights and to human lives, but it can't be defeated by military means. And in fact, the more the military forces are used, especially external Western military forces like the US and France, this is used by the extremist groups as a rallying cry. And they are able to mobilize more recruits and continue their fight because it's in the name of expelling Western forces, external forces. So the general trend in the US is the right one towards reducing the military engagement. But my belief is that it needs to end completely, and the United States should get out entirely away from this imperial policy, this presumption that we have the right to dictate what should go on in countries like Iraq and other parts of the world. And I'm afraid that if indeed I'm right, that the United States does keep some troops there, maybe it'll come down a little bit, and maybe there's less direct combat involvement, but some troops will remain. And this will only feed the political unrest that we've seen within Iraq. There are so many protests and so much upheaval from civil society. And of course, that unrest is rooted in many factors, but often there is the demand to expel the foreign forces. And especially as I understand, after the killing of General Soleimani in January of 2020, my understanding is the Iraqi parliament adopted a resolution calling for the removal of all external forces. As I say, the US is sort of moving in that direction, but again, I don't see a real commitment on the part of the US to end its strategy of military engagement
Professor, if the US's military engagement in Iraq, and indeed more widely, has not succeeded, why would French engagement be any different?
Yeah, really curious. You know, it's puzzling. I mean, a cynic would say maybe they're trying to deflect attention from their failures in West Africa, in Mali. But I think also, again, I'm not an expert in French policy, but it's in keeping with their own imperial pretenses. You know, France is a smaller player than the US, but there are similar views in that France has the right to exert its power, especially in its former colonial empire. And it feels that its use of military force can somehow try to resolve the problems. So they're not having so much of a direct combat role, but maybe not so many troops or, you know, as they say, boots on the ground, but instead they rely on airstrikes and drone attacks, similar to what the US has done. And this policy certainly will not work in trying to defeat Daesh and the terrorist groups. It only inflames resistance to the West. You saw the massive protests that went on after the killing of Soleimani. And France seems to feel like it can go ahead with a imperial policy, you know, imperial policy light, so to speak, you know, without a lot of ground troops. It'll be less than what they've tried in Mali. But that seems to be the explanation. I can't understand any other reason why they would want to get involved. And
all these changes that are taking place in the region, the Afghan debacle being merely the most recent, are they related to US drawdown, withdrawal, retreat?
well, I think partly this goes back to the original invasion of Iraq in 2003. Many people warned at the time that this war was not only unjust and unnecessary, but would have terrible consequences in the region and would lead to upheaval and disruption of relations among states and among peoples within those states. And sadly, we saw that as the rise of the insurgency against the American forces and I guess some could say it was a civil war within Iraq for those years. And it's interesting that ISIS and Daesh emerged out of the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then also out of the tremendous repression of the Sunni population by the Shia-led government in Baghdad. So I'm not saying that all of this is because of the US invasion and the US-British war in 2003, but it created this tremendous disruption and upheaval across the region. And many consequences of them have come from that.
Joseph, this rather goes to your point that the US is not really withdrawing. I think the professor used the phrase imperialism light.
Yeah.
But you can't really have imperialism light, can you? As the Afghan episode just showed us.
Yeah.
Once your physical force has run down to such a low level, actually the insurgents can sweep you away whenever they choose to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think to respond to something that was mentioned in that video there, firstly, the US are withdrawing in the sense of presence, but not fiscally, as I mentioned. France sees that as an opportunity to fill the military gap. And I think the most interesting thing is why France wants to do that. And I think it's actually quite a simple reason. I think they're suffering now a humiliation publicly, but they've been suffering with a lot of unrest due to ongoing stripping of civil liberties in France through the passport and other means. And I think this is almost a way to recapture some national pride. I think that's something that Macron wants to do. That's something that he's based his tenure on, is to try and regain some of that conservative majority that was lost to Le Pen.
His whole tenure, first the yellow vests.
Right.
Now
It's
this,
been marked by that.
This COVID rebellion.
Yeah.
Ongoing problems with the minority ethnic communities there, with the Muslim communities there.
Yeah.
A foreign adventure might be
might be a way
handy
to turn
way.
attention away. Yeah, absolutely. And I think then the second part of that is how withdrawn are the US going to be? How much will they allow France to do that? I think at any sight of unrest, they might be tempted to send troops back there very quickly. They have all the structures in place. There's also the question about arms. We know that last time around when Daesh came to some kind of power, it was because of arms going into the wrong hands. Has the US managed to control that flow of US weaponry? From what we've seen in Afghanistan, the answer to that would probably be no. So are they playing both sides? Are there other things going on here? Can we make those accusations still that we could a few years ago? There's a lot to be considered.
Jerry, I'm not a Francophile like Frank.
Quite
the opposite. And I don't want to be insulting, but I personally find the idea of the French army in Iraq risible. If the people of Iraq chased out the United States and Britain and the other coalition of the killing when they were in their hundreds of thousands, I frankly see it as a bit comic opera, the idea that France could fill that space.
Well, I think we first of all need to identify what France is and its history. French imperialism was amongst the most brutal on the planet in Africa. Anybody who has seen the Battle of Algiers will know what France did in Algeria was, and of course the good General de Gaulle was foremost in all these appalling war crimes. And I tend to agree that what is happening in Iraq at the moment is that for the moment French troops might substitute for US troops. The US, by the way, are not withdrawing any troops. What they're doing is withdrawing them from a combat role. They're keeping them as advisors and trainers for the Iraqi army.
Yes, but they could be driven out any time if the resistance groups in Iraq decided, well, if you're not leaving of your own accord, you'll leave under fire. They simply don't have enough people, enough stomach for another fight in Iraq.
Well, I don't quite see it that way. I think that what happened as a result of 2003 was that Iran actually gained a great deal of influence in Iraq. Al-Sadr, the Shia cleric, is a very influential figure there, and that's because he is Shia and allied to Iran. So I don't think that either Iran or the ruling groups in Iraq are really interested in defeating imperialism as such. What they want is a better deal. Mm-hmm. That's what they want. They want to push a better deal out of imperialism. The only groups that were seriously and had the potential to defeat imperialism in the region, of course, was the '79 revolution. And that really mobilized millions, and it could have defeated imperialism there and spread its influence throughout the region. But the US went into Iraq basically for its own purposes to secure the oil resources, for instance, was very central to it, and they still have the oil resources. Mm-hmm. Their multinational corporations still control the resources there.
And you can't get electricity in Iraq, which is one of the great energy producers of the world. Father, it is a bit beau geste, isn't it? The idea of France, or indeed any Europeans. The British Army could comfortably fit into Wembley Stadium just up the road here with plenty of empty space. The idea that Britain, that France, can, as it were, reoccupy the Middle East is fanciful, isn't it?
Indeed, but that's nonsense. Nobody's suggesting that. I mean, it's a matter of influence. not a matter of sending an army. Incidentally, I have to say, Jerry mentioned France in Algeria. The French in Algeria did not say the only good Algerian is a dead Algerian. The Anglo-Saxon settlers, the British settlers in North America, exterminated the whole native Indian population. A good Indian is a dead Indian. So I think the Anglo-Saxons have got a few sins.
He says he's not a Francophile.
On the conscience. And I'm surprised that you, as a Scottish person, I mean, you should be in favour of the old alliance.
The old alliance.
I don't think in national.
No.
At all.
No, but still, sorry, I couldn't.
It's all phony
I
to
couldn't
me.
help saying that. I mean, Professor, the elephant in the room, the thing which I think he was carefully skirting around, is the fact that the enormous influence which the state of Israel, the rulers of the state of Israel, have had on U.S. foreign policy, going back to neocons, going back to the first invasion of Iraq, and then subsequently again. And Israel, the rulers of the state of Israel, are paranoid about the Iranians. And they're only bringing up Iran as a focus of terrorism, which is actually incorrect. Iran is not sending cells of terrorists abroad, unlike what various Daesh and companies.
Unlike certain Gulf countries.
Well, yes, say no more. I mean, I think I get your drift. I mean, I think we have to. It's only one factor. I'm not a conspiratologist. I'm only saying, but it is an important factor.
I think you've opened a very interesting door with that point. Israel would not have the influence on France and on the European powers that it clearly has on the actions of the Americans.
Yasser Arafat.
That might make them more palatable in the region.
Yasser Arafat went to die in Paris, and he was honored and by, was it Giscard? Say no, Chirac. So I think that France have, and actually, if I wanted to wax historical, we go back to Napoleon. Napoleon invaded Egypt, and from ever since...
And embraced Islam, allegedly.
Well, he suggested it.
Some do.
But when they told him...
The Times front page said, Boney turns Turk.
When he was told the conditions were circumcision and giving up wine, he gave it up.
All right.
Wine probably poured. Well, but I mean, the French have felt very sore about losing Egypt, which were regarded as proprietary, right up to a Fashoda incident in Sudan at the end of the previous century, and actually no previous century, 2 centuries back. And so they still have this sore element. But I don't think it is military imperialism in the sense that they want to go and occupy Iran. They know very well they can't do it. They want to have the influence, they want to manipulate, yes. But
Joseph, whichever way you look at it, and the more this discussion has gone on, the more I've thought this, that to channel Tony Blair, the kaleidoscope has been shaken, or to channel Bob Dylan, which I'd rather do, the wheel's still in spin.
Yeah.
It does seem that we are in a period of change, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a transitionary period, and I think another important part of French intervention is looking at where Iran's interests now lie. Shanghai cooperation has just opened up a completely different spin on that, because if you move further towards Iran, you also move further towards China now. You also move further towards Russia. It comes back to what you were saying earlier. How far did France want to go post-Brexit to absolutely smash ties with the rest of NATO in that sense? So when they're doing this sense of bravado and they're kind of pushing out a more, let's call it imperialist perspective on what they want to do in the region, are they considering the further ramifications of how that influences Asian foreign policy as well, Russian foreign policy? The instability in Syria, how's that going to affect if they suddenly ally with Russia through the...
Well, I'll be candid. If I was running France, I would immediately withdraw from the political structures of NATO. I would hold a referendum in France on withdrawing from NATO altogether. I'd fly to Beijing. I'd fly to Moscow, and I'd fly to Tehran. And I'd be a French hero at the end of it.
Well, this is the thing. How far do they want to go with it? Because, like you said, there's an election next year. you have to kind of feel where the French people are at. And I think they're very focused on issues at home, like I said before. How much do they want France to suddenly become this globalist, interventionist,
Right.
and not ally with Germany anymore? That would be the other thing you've got to consider.
Although, as Jerry said, Germany and Russia are now linked umbilically through the Nord Stream.
Sure.
Jerry, you never agree with me on anything. What do you think of my French presidential manifesto? All right, as far as it goes?
Well, I think that the issue is not who's going to be the next French president, but the world will be dominated by what happens in the United States. What's happening in the United States now is there's a far-right push from Donald Trump. He's gaining more and more hegemony over the redneck states.
Over the working class, you mean?
I know, particularly those states that fought were in the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Yes, the white working class people. That's what you really mean.
No, I don't. It's not the white working class people that I really mean. I mean the Republican dominated. It's true that some white working class have been influenced in that way. Well, there you are. Hitler had supporters from the lumpen proletariat as well. We can't avoid that. But what's happening in the United States now, and particularly what's just happened in Texas, is an appalling indication on the question of abortion rights, is an appalling indication of what the future might look like, where Trump or his shoo-in to succeed in 2024.
You think Biden's better?
Biden is different, but not better. He's a different form of U.S. imperialism, but he's not better as such.
Well, singling out Trump.
He's more. He does thing in.
Trump would be fun. If he came back, it would be fun.
You know, you have a shocking scenario developing if the Trump or the Trump supporters could come in 24. What happens?
So we should support the Democrats.
No. You should not support them.
Where's the third party?
Definitely,
That's the problem, isn't it?
definitely not support them. Support the
Seven
Democrats.
million
But the logic of all that you're
No,
saying
it's not
is
the
that
logic.
we
logic.
should.
Definitely not. You should support the organised working class against them both.
I think
the
the
Democrats
audience
will
will
only pull the
so
wool over your
conclude.
eyes.
Frank, the last words to you as our resident Francophile, although with my program I could end up the president of France. Summarize, will Europe, including France, and perhaps particularly France, grow in influence in the Middle East if the United States pivots to Asia and away from the region?
Well, someone will have to grow in influence. I suspect it would be China rather than Europe, because China is spreading its tentacles worldwide. But I go back
Isn't that pejorative language, tentacles? Is that what we do, spread our tentacles?
well, it's meant to.
Sounds faintly poisonous.
I'm not a fan of the communist regime in Beijing, but anyway. I want to finish by quoting Pope Francis again to Ayatollah Grand Ayatollah Sistani. Love between brothers is better than fratricide, better than people killing each other. So we must foster, wherever we can, reconciliation, harmony, balance, settlements, even diplomacy is better. You know, Jojo are better than war.
As Mr. Churchill said, Jerry, you can't allow Winston Churchill to be the last words. The question, will France and Europe seek to fill the vacuum after the US fully pull out from Iraq and disengage from the region?
I think no, and I think they cannot do it. I think the US is still the world's hegemonic imperialist power. It dominates the world by its multinational corporations, by its finance, and it dominates the world by the dollar. The dollar is the global reserve currency and trading currency. As long as that remains the case, no other imperialist power can substitute There will be conflict, of course. China seeks to establish itself. Europe will have to seek to establish itself more. But in no way will the world fundamentally change until there's a huge change in the United States itself. And the election of Donald Trump again may bring about
Not the right kind of change. Joseph,
as a reaction against it.
Joseph, this is your debut. I must say you've done very well.
Very much.
Last words to you. What's going to happen if the US do pivot away? Will anyone try, and if try, succeed in filling the vacuum?
You mentioned one half of the world at the moment, as we know it, and the other half is China, which you mentioned. And I think it will all depend on relations between China and the US, okay, even if the US withdraw. Iran will not seek conflicts. They want the US to leave, but they don't want another power structure to fill it. That's why they've allied with China. So I think what we see is France perhaps posturing until this is all blown over. And then we see some semblance of normal process resumed. I think it's going to be more of the same, to be honest. I don't think the US is really going anywhere. If they did, we might see some conflict. I don't think they will.
It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back for the next show of Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen Television. From me, George Galloway, thank you for watching.